Hey Teams admins, welcome to the first 5 things to getting started with Teams, the IT Admin Edition. So there's been a lot of articles and presentations on getting started with Teams, but most of those are geared toward what you can do with the application itself. And as I've been deploying and testing Teams, I felt that it was important to talk about the things from the lens of an IT administrator though. And with the speed that Microsoft releases all the different technologies and updates, sometimes I think, and maybe you do too, that we have to immediately go out and take advantage of these tools or start using them before we're really even ready sometimes. So it's good to take a step back and think about if our organization is ready now. And maybe you are, and you can go ahead and just roll things out like this immediately. But also, maybe you're not, and you need to think about who can create groups and who can create teams and how you actually want to use these tools. And that's fine. It's better to do that up front than to come back in 6 months and realize, oh no, what have we gotten ourselves into and how do we dig ourselves out of this mess? So at the end of the session, just a heads up, I'm going to have links to resources that you can use as a companion to the things we're going to talk about today. But before we get too far in, I just want to do a really quick introduction. So I'm Jeremy Miller, and I'm an enterprise architect in higher education with a lot of my focus being on Microsoft-related technologies. I'm from Kentucky, land of fast horses. We have delicious bourbon and amazing basketball. So if any of those interest you, Kentucky is a great place to visit. If you want to connect with me after today, I'm in the Twitterverse at Millhouse. That is a zero because back in the day when I was getting 1,000 free hours of internet from an AOL disk, I guess I thought that was cool. So it stuck. I also have a blog at itspartlycloudy.com, so feel free to check that out and give me some clicks there. A lot of stuff about cloud-related technology, specifically Teams and Office 365, Azure. Uh, Here's my LinkedIn URL as well, so feel free to connect there as well. If you do connect on LinkedIn, maybe mention that you saw this session. That way I know who you are and where you know me from. And finally, I run the Central Kentucky Microsoft User Group. So if you're ever out in the area and want to come out, we'll definitely welcome you in with open arms. If you're at Ignite back in 2015 or you streamed the keynote, you may remember this quote from Satya. Our mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And empowering people and organizations, though, is not just about throwing a new tool over the fence and saying, we've, we've empowered you, so our job's done. Empowering them really starts with handing over the knowledge on how to solve a business challenge. And that takes us to our first step as an administrator to get started with teams. Since groups are the foundation of every team, the first thing you should think about is who you're going to give access to create them. If you've got a very small organization, maybe you just let everyone create teams from the beginning and all's good, but there are some arguments for restricting the creation too. Those restrictions may be just at the beginning so that you can put together a plan for rolling out, training, and supporting teams, or you may have ongoing restrictions to allow creation just by a specific set of people, like IT or Teams power users. One thing to keep in mind, and this really mainly applies to really large, extremely large organizations, is that there is a limit per tenant of 500,000 groups. And that's a lot of teams, so it's unlikely, but still possible that you'll run into the limit if you don't have some restrictions in place. You need to be aware that this does affect the ability not only to create groups and teams, but it's also going to apply to other Office 365 applications like creating new plans in Planner or groups in Stream. So if you put those restrictions in, then be aware of the kind of the side effects that you're going to get from that. As of today, one thing to know, the administrator that sets up these restrictions has to have an Azure Active Directory Premium P1 license. And you're going to have to use PowerShell Azure Active Directory module to set these restrictions. The restrictions don't apply to global admins and a couple of other Office 365 admin roles. So you can even have the creation completely turned off, but then admins can still do testing and create teams for others to pilot. If you'd end up deciding that it doesn't make sense to open creations to everyone or even just a subset of people, there are about 40 different graph APIs that have GA'd that you can then use to programmatically do things like create new teams, automatically add channels and tabs to those teams, or deploy apps in the teams or channels, and then a few other things. All right, number 2, decide the domain or domains that teams are created in. By default, they're going to be created in your default Office 365 domain. So in the case of mine, it would be created in itspartlycloudy.com. But you can use email address policies to put them in a different domain. So a common example is to put everything into a dedicated groups or teams domain. So then that would be groups.itspartlycloudy.com. Or if you need to even separate them further, you can do that with multiple domains by using those same policies to look at Azure Active Directory attributes. So a common example of that is in EDU tenants, where you may want to separate these by the type of person that created them. So maybe all of your students go into one domain and all of the teams created by faculty and staff go into another. Before you can use the extra domain like that though, you're going to have to set it up in Office 365 as an accepted domain. And the link that I'm going to give you at the end of this session will have a good tutorial on how you can accomplish all this. All right, number 3, will you use naming and expiration policies? So having a naming policy can give you some level of standardization and also kind of helps find relevant teams that are public that people want to join. And then the expiration policies are a way to kind of keep a clean house. And we'll talk about both of those, but we're going to start with naming policies. And you can configure these in a variety of ways. When you set them up, you're going to either be able to apply fixed strings or use attributes from Azure Active Directory when you create that name. The supported attributes you're going to be able to use from Azure AD are department, company, office, state or province, country or region, and title. So you don't have all attributes available, but you do have a pretty good sampling that you're going to be able to use. And then fixed strings, they're good for if you don't have an attribute that you can use that's going to meet your needs. They're a good fill-in that you can add to the name, and you can even combine the two. So you can have a fixed string at the beginning, and then maybe you postfix that or put a suffix of an attribute like department onto the name. So as an example, let's say that you want to prefix all of your teams with MVPDays and then a space dash space. And you can see in this example that I'm creating the Enchantment Under the Sea team. And if there are any Back to the Future fans here, you're going to get that reference, which I love those movies. Anyway, you're going to see that the prefix of my team is going to have that fixed string that I talked about, MVPDays space dash space, and then the team name. So that allows your user that's creating the team to see this is what the team name is actually going to be. Kind of like with the creation restrictions we talked about a little bit earlier, you're going to either need to have all of your users that use these groups or teams licensed for Azure AD Premium P1, or if you're in an EDU tenant with an Azure AD Basic license, then you'll be able to use these naming policies too. So now that we saw what it looks like to use a naming policy, I want to show some examples of a tenant that has no naming policy. And so looking at these examples that are pulled up here, you can see that it's really hard to tell what the purpose of these are, or maybe what department or what area they go to, or who created them. And while they could be legitimate names, especially the ALMAO and Chipotle groups, I'm probably going to join those later. I like to laugh almost as much as I like eating delicious queso burritos, but they kind of highlight some examples here of why you would want that policy. And if we look at specifically the school and research groups, you can see that in the case of the school group here, there are 5 different ones that have the exact same name. If we had a naming policy there, we could have some extra context either by maybe including the department that created that, or the title of someone, or the region that was created in, so that we get an idea of where that belongs. The other thing that it can help prevent is someone trying to masquerade as maybe a VIP or even a department, like a distribution group for HR or something, to capture emails that should not go to them. If you look at this Madison Thomas group, if you consider maybe that you have a CIO or CEO or some other VIP that has that name, someone could have created that and then another person may inadvertently send mail to that group thinking they're sending it to a confidential location to a specific person. Now with Teams, back in July, Microsoft changed the way that these appear in the global address list. So by default now, the team that is created within the Teams client is going to be hidden from the gal. The naming policies, though, remember they apply to all groups. So with a group itself, that does show up in Outlook. So you can still kind of think of this scenario whenever you're looking at your naming policies. So one final note about naming policies is that you do get the option to block specific words or phrases. And if you decide that that's something that you want to do in your tenant, know that they're not case sensitive. So you don't have to put in two different options if you want to block something with an uppercase letter or letters and lowercase. So case sensitivity doesn't matter there. And you get up to 5,000 different phrases that you're able to block. And you'll put those into a comma separated list, which you then pass to the configuration using PowerShell. And if you do that, be sure you save that comma separated list somewhere, because if you go back in later and you decide that you want to add another word to your list, and you pass that single word to the configuration, it's going to overwrite the existing list that's out there. So whenever you want to add words, you have to pass that entire list again. So save that list somewhere and keep that available if you need to use it again. Now, why do you think you would want to ban specific words? There are a lot of reasons. Some of those are maybe you need to ban offensive words or curse words. And I work in education, so I know how creative people can get. So you may have to even consider blocking some derivatives of those words or different spellings. You may spend more time than you would like on Urban Dictionary learning all kinds of interesting stuff. Another reason that you might want to ban something is if you think back to the last slide where we saw the Madison Thomas group, you may take that example and decide that you want to block your CEO's name or maybe a specific department like payroll or human resources. If you block that phrase so that someone can't masquerade as that department. Now in a tenant I have, we were piloting Teams when that first came out, and I had a small pilot group, and the very first team that they decided to create was simply named Everyone. It was great for that person because that meant everyone to them that they had in that team. They thought that just meant everyone. For the entire organization, though, now there was a team that was just called Everyone, and that was before we had any type of naming policy in there. So anyone that would go out and look at Teams immediately thought, oh, this is Everyone. I must join this group, or should be in this group. So we went back and actually blocked everyone in that tenant, and you may need to do things like that too as you start to roll out Teams and find the things that people are naming them. The other thing we talked about was expiration of Teams. And one of my biggest reasons for setting an expiration policy really is to just kind of keep a clean house out there. If you've ever been an Exchange admin, or maybe you are now, you've probably been asked 100 times about whether a group or a public folder is still used or needed any longer. And when that happens, you can take a guess based on a little bit of data, but you may not even know who originally requested that distribution group. And to prevent that with Teams, we can use the expiration policy. Today, in most cases anyway, talking about distribution groups or most resources in IT, IT is in charge of provisioning those. But when we get into Teams and we go from funneling requests through IT to allowing large amounts of non-IT people to create them, the numbers are going to quickly get out of hand. You're going to have test groups and groups that are only needed for a few days, and so those can grow exponentially. With that expiration policy, though, we're going to allow the owners of the team to decide if they still need the data instead of putting all that work back on the IT group. Now, one of the fears that I've heard is about the loss of data. But Microsoft really does a good job of giving the owners plenty of notification and time to renew the team before it expires. So this is an example of an email that comes in when your group is about to expire. You're going to get these, the team owner will get these at 30 days, 15 days, and then again at 1 day. In addition to the email alerts, also in the Teams client, you're going to get an activity alert that you can see will say, hey, this is when your team is going to expire. You need to renew that if you still need it. All they have to do is simply in the email, click renew group, or within the Teams client, they can renew it there. They can actually even go into the settings of that specific team and proactively renew it. There's a setting at the bottom that shows the team expiration, and they can just renew it ahead of time. The good thing about this too is if the owner decides, I'm not going to renew the group right now, or they just ignore it or forget, after that 30 days, the team actually goes into a soft deleted state. So it's not actually gone, even though no one can access that. They have 30 days after that time to come back in, click renew group, and that will restore everything back to its original state. Now, if it gets into a soft deleted state and you have to renew that, they need to know that things don't immediately come back. It can take, I think that the documented time is up to 24 hours, but it can take a little bit of time for all of those resources to come back and for them to get access to those again. When you go to configure the expiration policy, you have a couple of different options here, and the first one that you need to decide is how long you want the group to last before it expires. And so out of the box, there are two options. One is 180 days, one is 365. And then the custom option allows you to specify any number of days. So you can either do 6 months or 1 year, or you can decide I want to pick a specific number of days before the group expires. And then the second thing here is an email address that you need to put in for groups with no owners. So if I create a team and then 6 months later I leave and I'm the only owner of that team, now that team is basically orphaned, has no owner. There are members out there that can still use the team to collaborate, but the owner, it doesn't exist. And in those cases, we don't want the team to just expire and go away with no one knowing it. So then an email will be sent to this notification address. Now that's one of the reasons that I always recommend as a best practice that your teams always have more than one owner. It helps to limit the teams that would show up with an orphaned state with no owner to them. You can set this expiration on either all of your groups, specific groups, or you can have it set to none, which would be essentially off. I know there is a user voice request out there right now that is asking for the ability to set expiration on all groups, but then allow specific exceptions. So expire all groups except for these three really important ones. And while I'm talking about user voice, I do want to give a big plug for using it. If you're not already aware of how it works, it's a place you can go out and give the product group direct feedback on Teams, as well as a ton of other Microsoft products. You can go out, create your own suggestions, or you may find that something you were going to suggest is already out there, and you can add a vote to that to kind of vote it up and show that there's more people wanting that. And then you can share it on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or however you like to share things like that to try to get more people involved and more people on board with that specific suggestions. Now, my experience with user voice is that Microsoft takes it really seriously, so you can really kind of help shape the future of the products that you're using. If you want to find it, aka.ms/Teams feedback is the Microsoft Teams specific voice feed, specific user voice. But you can also go out to your favorite search engine and look for user voice plus the product name that you're looking for, and you'll be able to find that one as well. Now, if you're a small org, your global admins may be the people who also do all the Teams management. But if you have a larger IT department or just have another reason to have more granularity or segregate roles, there are customized administrator roles, which brings us to number 4, and that is to assign admin roles. There are currently 4 role types for Teams administrator roles. The first one is a Teams communication administrator. And if you're in that role, you're going to be able to manage all the meeting details, calling functionality, so things like calling policies and phone number assignments. And then you also get access to call analytics to help with troubleshooting. The next two are pretty similar. Teams communication support engineer and Teams communication support specialist. So of the two, the engineer is considered the higher level role. With these, you're going to get access to do call analytics for troubleshooting with both roles. The engineer is actually going to be able to see the full details of all the calls, while if you're in that specialist role, you have to search for a specific user and then you only can see the details of that specific user you're searching for. And the last one here is Team Service Administrator, and that's basically what your full Teams Administrator is going to be. That gives you all settings, all configurations, basically all of the things that the communications admin, the support engineer, and specialist will get, plus the ability to do the full configuration within the Teams and Skype Admin Center. All right, number 5, will you allow guest access in your Teams? In almost every organization, you're going to have a project or work group that you need to include people who don't work at your company. So you're going to collaborate with those people in some way. And so today what you may be doing is you're working in an internal team and you decide, oh, hey, we need to bring this other vendor in to help with X. Maybe you send them an email or you send them data some way that they then respond back, probably via email. Then you have to take that back to your team and relay the information. With guest access, you can bring those people right into the team and make that collaboration more efficient. Not only that, but you're going to be able to keep your data inside your tenant, inside your team, and keep control of that instead of sending it out externally. And all you need is an email address. So a corporate email address, even consumer email addresses now can be invited in to be guests in a team. They will show up just as if they had an account right in your domain. So they're going to be able to have that same access to the chats and files and meetings that an internal team member would. This kind of makes sense, but by default, guest access is disabled. So you're going to have to make that decision. Does guest access make sense for my business? And if it does, then you have to go turn that on. The good thing is it's not just an on or off option. You can go into the configuration, and these configurations are tenant level. So guest access is a tenant level thing. You can go into the configuration and set things specifically for calling, what the guest has access to in meetings, and what they have access to do in messaging. Now, with most anything, there's some kind of limitation to be aware of, and the guest access limitation is how many you can actually have. So you're going to be able to have 5 guests per licensed user. So basically, you're not going to be able to set up a tenant, say, just for yourself. You have 1 licensed user and decide I'm going to invite 200 different people to participate. So 5 guests per licensed user, and that seems pretty reasonable for most tenants. All right, so there you have it. It's the first 5 things to getting started with Teams as an IT administrator. I want to do a quick recap so we can remember them all. Number 1, you're going to decide who can create teams in your tenant. Number 2, you're going to decide which domain or domains teams are created in. Number 3, decide if you're going to use naming and or expiration policies. Number 4, go out, assign administrative roles to the proper people in your organization. And number 5, you're going to figure out if guest access is appropriate for your tenant, and if so, you're going to enable that. And now that you saw these 5 tips, you can take them back to your organization and hopefully avoid the clutter that could happen, and most importantly, have a plan for the governance and administration of teams so that you end up with a very successful implementation. I want to thank you guys for joining today and watching my session. I promised at the beginning that I would have a full list of resources to accompany all the topics that I talked about today. And to make that easier, I'm going to put a post out on my blog. It's partlycloudy.com. I'll also tweet out a link to that blog after this is over, so everyone will have access to that. But you can find all of those resources in a blog post there. Thank you very much.